Now, or is it that they're worried that something's about to happen where they might lose control of the population and they might need to actually just put away certain troublemaking individuals? Maybe. Maybe we're being paranoid. But maybe we're not. They're there for some reason and nobody knows. Go and check it out. Rex 84. It's worrying. Next slide, please. However, you see, you know, and I don't need to say too much about this, but it was clear, particularly from the open forum last night, that most people of our ilk, with the kind of interest that we have that brings us to a place like this, have a feeling that something big is about to happen to the world. A change, a raising of consciousness, or, some kind of, what we're talking about, super waves or solar cycles, whatever. Something's going on that seems it's going to change the earth. Next slide, please. And we're living through this change now. Now, do not think for 1 minute that those powers that be don't also know this. And this is the thing, you see, if you're wondering why there is an agenda of control, well, anybody in power, they're not stupid. They know this stuff probably better than we do. Next slide, please. And by the way, all the 2012 stuff. I know I'm biased because I've been involved with this book, but it doesn't matter. Beyond 2012 is the best compendium you're going to read of everything that might or might not happen in 2012. If you're interested in what's going to happen, you need to read this book, and Jeff's got some copies here this weekend. But if you read anything about 2012, there are so many ancient prophecies, cross-referencing modern prophecies, astronomical things which seem to correlate with 2012, that it seems something is in the offing. And I think Peter Taylor very much made that point yesterday when he was saying that he thinks there's going to be something that's going to change the climate. Which brings us to, next slide, please. This brings us to the gurus of our age. And Al Gore has been doing, well, it depends which way you look at it, sterling work for promoting the concern about global warming. Okay, here he is. And now, what can we say? Now, Al Gore, of course, lots of people feel sorry for Al Gore because he didn't win the presidential election that year when Bush seemed to, get it by rather dubious means. So there is a kind of sympathy vote towards Al Gore. But he's, seems to be concerned, as he should be, about the environment on planet Earth. Next slide, please. And his film, An Inconvenient Truth, has been hugely influential in promoting man-made global warming. And that's fine if it also were to take into account the other side of the debate, because we're hearing continually about man-made global warming as if that is the key issue that is damaging our planet today. However, as you heard by Peter Taylor yesterday, there are other factors that maybe are not being taken into account. Next slide, please. And, this is worrying because things like the Live Earth concerts a few weeks ago, there's a massive wave of propaganda about man-made global warming. And you have thousands of people all around the world clapping their hands and screaming and cheering and saying, yes, we're causing this. Rock on! It was kind of crassly, glibly horrible in its strange way. And I don't know if anybody of you saw any of those concerts, but most of the bands didn't look like they gave two hoots, to be honest. They were just up there thinking, well, we're going to sell a few more records now. Next slide, please. But we need, I think, to be thinking much more about this. And I was going to say this before I knew that Peter was even going to say what he said yesterday. Many people feel that solar cycles, cosmic cycles, play as much, if not more, role in the changing of the climate than we do by puffing out CO2 into the atmosphere. That is not to say that what we are doing is right. It's common sense, let's say it now, to look after the planet. Isn't it obvious? Shouldn't it be obvious? I've recycled for years. I don't flush the loo every time unless you need to because it's such a waste of water. It's common sense to conserve the planet and stop cutting the rainforest down. Right? Let's get this straight. It's obvious. And yet we're getting people preaching to us now as if, it's only because of global warming that we ought to be thinking about this. And we should be feeling very, very guilty. Next slide, please. The sun, however, seems to play a role. And there have even been some crop circles that seem to direct us towards the sun and thinking about the sun. Some people will recall this crop circle from 1994. It showed a map of the constellation Cetus with Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter and the moon in it in a very particular phase. And what this showed was a date. So it appeared in 94, and it showed the date of the 6th of April, 2000. Well, when that date finally arrived, and in fact, it was so accurate you could tell the time, midnight GMT on the cusp of the 6th and 7th of April, 2000. If you want to know more about this, quick advert, read my little book, World Harvest, out there. There's a whole chapter about it. Next slide, please. When that date finally arrived, we had a huge solar flare, one of the biggest we'd had in years. This Earth was flooded with solar particles. The aurora was seen as far south as Mexico that night, right around the world, auroral displays. And many people think the sun profoundly affects the evolution of life on Earth. And there have been other crop circles. Horace Drew was talking about, crop circles that seem to show calendars and astronomical information. Well, it began a lot earlier with earlier formations. And there was a number of formations from the mid-90s that clearly showed dates and times, which when those dates and times arrive, always seem to correlate with some kind of significant celestial phenomena. But the sun, especially given how many crop circles seem to show solar symbolism, some people think something's telling us we ought to take more notice of what is going on with our neighboring star. Next slide, please. And the trouble is, when you try to say, actually, it might not be all man-made global warming that's the issue, maybe we need to look at what's going on. And here's a book by Nigel Calder and Hendrik Svensmark, The Chilling Stars. When they published this book and then had a Channel 4 program about how solar cycles may be more important than anything to do with man-made global warming, guess what happens? They're vilified, attacked as unscientific. Nigel Calder used to be the editor of New Scientist magazine. And suddenly he's unscientific. A fraud. And this is what happens. And as Peter said yesterday, because there's so much money invested in investigating man-made global warming, all they see is that. If you don't investigate that, you don't get your funding. So everything is geared towards man-made global warming being the cause. And it's hard to get out of that. Next slide, please. And when people say the ice sheets, every time you turn on the news, another bit of the ice sheet's fallen off. Global warming, we're melting, we're all going to drown. When other scientists say, do you know there are as many new ice sheets forming as there are ones falling apart, it's just shifting, they're not given coverage. No debate. Now, I'm not saying they're right. I am not a scientist. I do not know if they're right. But what I do hear is clearly there's another side to the debate that is not being given any prominence at all. Channel 4 were very brave to transmit that one-off program. I bet they don't again because they got attacked by the scientific community for doing so. So when experts who are scientists say, actually, the sea levels aren't even rising, why do you keep going on about this? They're not saying what they're supposed to be saying. They are then pushed under the carpet. However, meanwhile, when other experts like this, next slide please, come along, like Madonna, and say, jump up and down if you want to save the earth, as she did at Live Earth, and then tells you that you are causing it with man-made global warming, well, we needn't worry. The experts like Madonna are telling us what to think, so that's good enough, isn't it? And then, next slide, please. Bless his soul, next slide, you get the wagging finger of Al Gore. Oh, man-made global warming. We can make a difference, but you've got to think about what you do. There's just something wrong. There is an attitude, and it's about control. But who's doing the controlling? Next slide, please. You see, off the back of this, you have the green agenda. And like I just said, I try to think green. We should conserve the planet and the environment, right? Can we say that again? It goes without saying. However, next slide, please. You then get things like this. When people dye their poodles green to make a point, right, for green protest, you think, okay, and it's green. Oh, you've got to be green. Oh, look at what you're doing in your life. Next slide, please. You then get protest marches against 4x4 cars. Oh, 4x4s, oh, they drink the fuel, oh, very bad for the environment. Now, they might be. Maybe they are. But hang on a minute, look at what else is going on around the world. I mean, all the things you could protest about to make a point. What about your loss of freedoms? What about the loss of freedom of speech? What about that? What about 9/11? Getting into the truth of that. But no, let's go and protest about 4x4s. I think there's something out of kilter. Next slide, please. And then it's like, the polar bears are drowning. Polar bears are drowning where the ice sheets are melting. Now, that's very emotive because we all love polar bears. I don't want to see polar bears drown. You don't either. We don't want polar bears to drown, do we? We don't want that. And nobody wants that. But in fact, first of all, a lot of the images they show are very manipulative. Polar bears swim anyway. They often swim. And they show a polar bear in the water like this is abnormal. It's actually not. Right, but okay, no, we don't want that. But maybe the polar bears are gradually migrating to other areas. But what if the ice is melting? Maybe that is a natural cycle. We know from geological records, ice comes and it goes. It comes, we just happen to be in one, maybe where it's retracting. But the problem is they're saying it's all global warming. Next slide, please. You go on holiday and you come back and it's like, you didn't fly, did you? You think, well, look, it's very difficult. Let's see, the problem is this. If you stop flying tomorrow, if the whole world, it's already been said this weekend, stop flying, if the whole world gave up 4x4s, it's not actually now going to make any difference. Now, that doesn't mean to say we therefore should go crazy and not show respect to the environment, but it actually won't make any difference. And if it is to do with solar cycles, well, you might as well just enjoy it while you've got it. Because if Peter's right, we're all over in a few years anyway in terms of the civilization we have today. I hope he's wrong. But in other words, and when I gave a crop circle talk in Australia recently, now, was it more important to share that knowledge with people who didn't know it, or should I have stayed at home? I don't know. I feel all guilty now. Flew back from Stansted the other day, and then driving back from Stansted, somebody put a big billboard up in the field saying, did you think about your carbon footprint when you flew? Bloody hell. And then, next slide, please. And then on top of all this, it's just this general, the wagging finger. And it pisses me off. Because what's happening here is in the name of a good cause, we are being encouraged to control each other. People are calling for more restriction, more control, because they think it's doing good, which is nice, but it's, I think, misplaced. Next slide, please. When you get posters like this, global warming is your fault. I'm sorry, there's something wrong. Even if you at least had the other side of the debate, we could have a sensible debate about it and get a good middle ground solution. But at the moment, it's so biased towards one side of an argument, the other side of the debate is not being covered. Next slide, please. We are controlling each other. This is the genius of it. If there is an agenda of control, you don't have to look out there at somebody superimposing it on you. Actually, as a civilization, as a society, we're doing it to ourselves. Read George Orwell's 1984. That's how it worked. People began to police each other, snitch on each other. That's how it worked in the Soviet Union in the bad old days when every other person was an informer. We're encouraged to do it to ourselves. They, whoever they may be, don't need to do anything. Next slide, please. And meanwhile, by the way, the real cause of most pollution going into the atmosphere, carry on, right? Big industry, it makes lip service, pays lip service to being greener. But at the end of the day, it ain't. And what's happening is the shift of guilt, if you accept man-made warming being the main problem, the shift of guilt's come onto our shoulders, make you feel bad. But they carry on the same. And other, so-called third world nations that are coming up the ladder, they're pumping this stuff out by the day. And it's another great excuse, of course, to try to keep them down in their place. Not to mention, give us green taxes, make us pay more and feel happy about paying more because we're saving the planet. But this is not being addressed. All the guilt's falling on our shoulders, whereas they're not shouldering their responsibility. And that's not to say there aren't politicians who care, because I think they are. But it's all currently coming onto us. Next slide, please. And very briefly, because I can see Sheila making her way up the side of the room here. Okay, we've got 5 minutes, I hope. Very briefly. We also have, as you know, with the war on terror, an agenda of fear. We control each other also through fear. The recent bomb attack at Glasgow Airport and others, where the bloke's so stupid he set light to himself before the bomb even got near the bloody airport. But anyway, that aside, we're all absolutely scared. There was that scare in Tesco recently. I've always said it only takes one bomb in a Tesco or an Asda, and you're going to have in your bag searched every time you go shopping. Do you see what's happening? Control, control, control. When you go to the airport now, I mean, soon, never mind your carbon footprint, you won't want to fly because it's getting so ridiculous, the hassle, the provocation they give you. Next slide, please. And now they've said, of course, that liquids and baby milk, there was the alleged baby milk bomb plot, which has never been scientifically proven. Now, have you noticed how quickly that's fallen out of the news? But last year, there was this plot. They had baby milk, and it was going to blow up, and they were going to go into the toilets in the aircraft and do this incredible chemistry set thing and blow up. Well, all scientists have looked at this and said you might get a little pop if you were very, very lucky. You're not going to blow up an aeroplane. But no, I mean, Piers Adams, who played some fantastic recording music here a few years ago, he recently was flying wherever, and he was forced to drink the baby milk, right, from the bottle to prove it wasn't a bomb. What kind of world are we living in? This is ridiculous. And soon, it's shoe bombs and all this. So you have to take your shoes off when you go through. And soon, next slide, please. What's he going to wind up in? That is going to be the only solution. Well, no, maybe it's not such a bad idea. No, actually, it is. Okay, this is where we're going. I want to end on a hopeful note. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, one very quick thing. Just a little thing. Do you remember in the first Gulf War, right, they bombed a factory, and they said it was an arms factory. And then it turned out, and this was proven, it was a baby milk factory. Do you remember that? And I just think it's interesting that now they're saying that baby milk could be a bomb. Think about that. So now they feel good that they legitimately bombed a baby milk plant because it could have been explosive. Anyway, right, quickly, move on. Move on, Jake. Let's go into the next one. So, in other words, there is clearly some agenda of control. But we, I think, are beginning to do most of the controlling. Please consider this. Many people believe there are secret societies, corporations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, the Illuminati, the Arty-Farty, whoever they are, believe there is some agenda to control us. And I have to say, I don't know really who's doing it, but I think that's true. It doesn't take much to look around and see an agenda of control. So if this is going on, next slide, please, what can we do about it? Right, now the good bit. We can free ourselves. And I just want to now briefly show you some examples of how people have stood up to oppression over the years and made a difference, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to make the difference. Next slide, please. Protests do work. CND might not have stopped Trident and nuclear missiles, but you don't know in the totality of time what difference it might make. Things might be much better because they protested. Iraq war, the protests against that, it didn't fail. It didn't stop us going to Iraq, but I'm willing to bet we would have bombed Iran by now if people hadn't have stood up and made their feelings known. Genetically modified food has been massively held back in England by people saying no. Collectively. It's coming in slowly, but people collectively said no, made a huge difference. Even the Real Ale Society has saved many breweries from going under, little independent breweries, by saying, we want local brew here. We don't want your Green King muck or whatever. People stand up, they protest, they boycott pubs, and in the end, economics dictate things have to change. Next slide, please. Those are little things. Next slide, please, Jake. Look at what can happen. The Berlin Wall. Now, some conspiracy theorists might argue that in itself was all a big manipulation. But I think at the end of the day, the human spirit was genuine there. And the Berlin Wall, suddenly who could have thought that? The Soviet Union was over. And why? Because enough people stood up at the same time and said no. Next slide, please. Suffragettes, ladies, you can vote. But you couldn't 100 years ago. And the irony is because a lot of people don't bother to vote now because they haven't got any faith in the political system. But once upon a time, people threw themselves in front of horses to get a vote, and it worked. Think on this. Next slide, please. Nelson Mandela was president of South Africa. Some people still call him a terrorist. But the point is, who would have thought it? Who would have thought that could have happened? But enough people got behind him, and his strength and belief took him there. Next slide, please. Never say you're powerless. Solidarity in Poland. They fought the Soviet oppression, and they won. And they won a lot of freedoms for Poland, and it set dominoes going, which I think in the end wound up with the Berlin Wall, because they stood up and stood against the oppression, right? Next slide, please. The Orange Revolution. The Ukraine still has big problems politically, but nonetheless, people refused to accept what was obviously a crooked election vote. They stood in the freezing cold for days and days and days and would not go home until it was announced they would rerun the election, because they said no. Are you thinking about this? We can make a difference. Never think you are powerless. Next slide, please. Right, Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the legally elected ruler of Burma, has been under house arrest on and off for nearly 20 years because every time they let her out, she protests again. And so they lock her up again. But she doesn't stop. And as such, she is a glowing beacon of an example of resolve, and it makes a difference. And they hate her, but they can't kill her because she's too powerful. Next slide, please. We're nearly at the end, Sheila, don't worry. Who would have thought that? Ian Paisley and Jerry Adams at the same table, my God. Now, listen, okay, maybe this is all some Illuminati agenda, but I don't know. It's still an amazing thing. Who would have thought it, working together? Why? Because at the end of the day, you have to. And if there is Middle Eastern terrorism going on, sooner or later, even though they're a bunch of bastards, maybe, we're going to have to talk to them and say, look, what is the problem? And that was the only way the IRA problem got sorted. People aren't happy, but it's the only way to a solution. But solutions can be found. Next slide, please. Right, a quote from Gandhi. He said, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Remember that. Always." Think of that. Next slide, please. We are honestly really near the end. If there is an agenda, if we are puppets, if we are controlling ourselves, if we are being operated by strings, cut the strings. Those examples there show it can be done, right? If the world is about to change, what they are terrified of is losing control of us. Why? Not because they think we're weak, but because they know we're powerful. Please remember that. Or they wouldn't even be trying to control us. They know we are powerful. Use that power. Next slide, please. Some of you will know about the 100th monkey syndrome, critical mass consciousness. Mass consciousness works. I have spoken many times here over the years about it. Go and read things like The Field. Lynn McTaggart will be speaking to you about the power of intention this afternoon. Listen to her. These things work. You heard what Jude said yesterday. Consciousness, just a shift of consciousness will change the world. Next slide, please. This crop formation appeared in 2001. Next slide, please. When you blur it, the dots resolve into a face. And I've often thought that what this crop formation was doing was holding up a mirror to us to say, hey, you have got to look at yourselves now. Some people thought it was an alien face, but I don't think so. I think it's a human face. And it was asking us to look at us and what we have and our power. Next slide, please. Because we are incredibly powerful beings. And step out of being a tool of control and make some positive changes in your life in whatever little way you can, and it will have an effect. I've said it before, but I make no apology for saying it again. Don't be a tool of control. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andy Thomas.
Thank you very much.